Dudes swagged out like Ryuk from Deathnote, girls dressed like Bratz dolls. The hottest place to be is a Deaftones concert. Don't get too excited, you haven't time traveled back to the 2000s. You're actually still in 2024. So yeah, your Discord conversations still can get leaked. What's good everybody? My name is Carson Craning, back at it again with another YouTube video. Today, we're talking about the Y2K trend. And in case you've been living under a rock, Y2K is a ginormous trend right now. Everyone's walking around looking like they could be in a new metal music video. The only thing missing is those little beards. But one thing you probably didn't realize is how the trend is actually evolving really dramatically. And is slowly not only dying, but becoming something completely different. Let's get this started and talk about what Y2K actually was. Y2K was the era from the late 90s to the early 2000s. And the name of the era was defined from the fear of a specific computer bug. You see, in the late 90s, people thought the internet and technology wouldn't work once the year 2000 would hit. Like, computers just wouldn't be able to process the fact that the years were not starting with a 1 and instead were starting with a 2. And people legitimately thought the whole internet would crash. And this drove a whole wave of sort of like fear and paranoia as people legitimately bought like excess gold and food supplies because they thought the internet and in turn the whole economic system would collapse and crash. And so this era of the late 90s and early 2000s was sort of named after this hysteria event. And of course this was the early internet days. Y2K was marked aesthetically by this boom in technology and the internet. There was a lot of early development in computer design programs, and so aesthetically this era is marked by the hallmarks of those early design programs and the aesthetics that were available within those programs, which had at the time a much more limited set of tools than we have now. And so everything kind of has this cohesive aesthetic to it a little bit more. And there was sort of this feeling that technology was taking over. And so from that, in the Y2K, we got this sort of cyber aesthetic. There's a lot of visualization of the internet. There was a lot of Chrome because they thought the future was Chrome, kind of like that one SpongeBob episode.
Okay, what's going on here? Why is everything Chrome?
Everything is Chrome in the future!
And there was a lot of things that were sort of science fiction influenced. Electronic music was also beginning to really take off at the time. You had artists like Aphex Twin who were really pushing the boundaries of what music could be. Rave culture was becoming big because of that as well. There was also a huge cultural exchange that was happening from the West to Japan. While there had been some cultural exchange from Japan to the West before, it really took off during this time. Fashion, anime, manga, and video games. And so Japan really also had an influence on this Western cyber aesthetic, though their take might have been a little more grungy, and it's kind of where we get the idea of like a cyber grunge. And I think the most evident place where you see Japan's massive influence on the West during the Y2K era was with the anime series Serial Experiments of Lain. While this wasn't huge at the time, the Y2K cyber revival has really brought it into being one of the most influential pieces of media from this era. Have you heard this song?
And you don't seem to understand.
And you have been influenced by Serial Experiments of Lain, as this was the theme song from it. And a lot of the aesthetics of Serial Experiments, as well as Wong Kar-wai films, have sort of influenced the idea of a cyber grunge aesthetic. Now, fast forward from the early 2000s to 2021. This is where we see that sort of cyber Y2K revival and where we sort of see early tastemakers bringing this aesthetic back. Really, the first tastemakers that began bringing back elements of this aesthetic are hyperpop artists, Drain Gang, and their TikTok followers, people who are influenced by them. Hyperpop took a lot of their visuals, specifically influenced by like the cyber chrome and the gloss sort of Y2K futurism. And Drain Gang, the countercultural rap group from Sweden, began sampling a lot of elements of Y2K fashion, as well as a lot of the early internet editing styles. Now, Drain Gang and Young Lean had sort of been doing this for years, the same with like those hyperpop artists. But it was in 2021 where you saw hyperpop and drain gang really become popular and start having these subcultures form around it more heavily on TikTok. And this is where you really first saw the Y2K aesthetics and fashion trends come into play. Particularly around this very specific brand of Y2K, this cyber grunge Y2K. Low-rise cargo pants, all over prints, a lot of inspiration from early 2000s Japanese streetwear. Now let me make this clear about this early age of the Y2K revival. This cyber aesthetic of Y2K, which was becoming popular on TikTok, was a lot bigger than it was when it actually happened. Not everyone in the late 90s was dressing in this sort of cyber Y2K way. It was actually a very small group of people. This sort of cyber grunge trend was very limited to certain subcultures and really only happened in densely concentrated urban areas. While you can definitely find a lot of cool media and things that represent this sort of cyber grunge trend, to think that this was what like the late 90s and early 2000s were like for a lot of people is simply not true. Instead, what Y2K was like for most people in terms of fashion and aesthetics was something more similar to what I'm going to call glitz Y2K. Think about like the media that sort of is represented by Britney Spears, Bratz dolls, a lot of studs and sparkles. These things sort of actually live more in our subconscious when we think about Y2K, and more in people who actually live through its actual memories. And this is sort of more accurate of what the early 2000s were actually like in terms of fashion and style and trends and whatnot. And so as the Y2K trend has gone on, you're starting to see a lot less of this cyber grunge and more of this general Y2K trend. Y2K has begun to become really big, and it's gone to become something that's very mainstream at this point. You are starting to see the trend slowly evolve and die. And specifically the people who sort of brought the Y2K trend to fruition are starting to form something new. And this sort of what I'm going to call a counter or post Y2K aesthetic is being formed. But before we get into that exact trend, we need to do a little bit of a history lesson. Okay, the glitz of Y2K is what the mainstream was. Of course, there's also that cyber grunge counterculture, but cyber grunge was not the only countercultural movement. Another huge one was what was kind of going on with alternative rock and alternative metal, particularly with things around like nu metal. There was a sort of a subculture that went along with that that was sort of a darker take on the Y2K style. And you definitely are seeing this become popular. For example, jnco jeans, Ed Hardy, music as well. Deaftones is one of the biggest acts in rock right now. You would have told someone in 2015 that, it would have blown their mind. In the early 2000s, that's sort of what I'm going to call Deaftones style of Y2K evolved. That style in 2006 and 2007 really became more robust. It was metal and rock mixed with skate culture and other media, and it's from this 2006-2007 era of the style that originally started in Y2K that we're seeing people really create this counter Y2K, new countercultural aesthetic. And when you look at the people who are doing this aesthetic, you are either one of two people. You are either a teen vampire or you look like Jesse Pinkman. There's no in between. Either you're a 17,000-year-old vampire who looks like a 17-year-old pale teen heartthrob, or you're slanging that rock with Walter White. There's no in between. You have to choose between one of those two lifestyles. I'm sorry. But again, the people who are sort of into this are wearing brands like Affliction, Evisu, Tap Out, Southpole, a lot of different sort of skate, alternative rock influenced brands. It's definitely on the edge of what we would consider goth or maybe emo, but definitely only related and not in those categories. I think this is really the natural progression of what someone who was into the Deaftones in like 1999 would be wearing and be interested in 2006 and 2007. Again, it's very rock inspired, but there's also influence from like Deathnote and sort of like gothic aesthetics particularly. And I'm not saying gothic in the way that's been used recently, where it's sort of like a Rick Owens, Bauhaus, minimalist, Joy Division gothic, but more of a post-Victorian Baroque type of gothic, where there's all this ornateness that has turned black and dark and muddy. Some early tastemakers in bringing this style into the 2020s have been like Semetary or Carson, and there are a lot of elements in this fashion trend that are sort of the spiritual successors to that cyber grunge trend, right? You have things like different washes of denim and intricate all over prints, and you can sort of see how this could be the parallel countercultural movement to what cyber grunge was. Of course, there's also a lot of relation to Twilight and sort of the dark teen, vampire aesthetic, I guess I want to call it. Again, a lot of the people who are participating in this trend seem to be like 18 and younger. And because of that, this trend often sort of gets labeled as Y2K, even though it really is a separate thing. 2006, 2007 were like 3 to 4 years after the Y2K era. And while it has origins in Y2K, it's distinctly different at this point. Now again, something I've noticed is that a lot of younger people specifically are into this trend, while older people who tend to be like 24 and older really don't like this trend or don't want to participate in it. I think I know one dude who's 24 who's like really about it, but everybody else who's a little bit older who would normally dive right into something like this are really kind of ignoring it and kind of labeling it as corny. This trend is really divisive, I think. And I think a reason that this is so divisive by age is because a lot of the younger people who are into it weren't really around in 2006 or 2007. They can't really remember that era, maybe they were just born at the time, or if they were alive, they were way too young to remember anything. And so the only way that they can experience this era is through media. It's through things like Deathnote, Twilight. However, for people who are like my age and older, we definitely remember this era. And I think many of our memories of this era sort of come with like a cringe involved with it. I think a lot of people's experiences with this particular counterculture weren't super positive, especially like the Jesse Pinkman side of things. I think the teen vampire side of this aesthetic is looked at in a slightly better light because there were a lot of cringy things with like the vampire mania that happened in 2006. But the Jesse Pinkman vibe, I think a lot of people really can't stand because their annoying relative probably dressed like this at the time. You just like sort of see these t-shirts and you can smell the Monster Energy and the chewing tobacco, probably the gamer piss. White people who wore Affliction were kind of weird at the time for the most part. And look, I can completely understand why if you're older, you're not necessarily going to be interested in these aesthetics, and I know why you might think they're cringe or corny. And to be honest, I was in the same boat a year ago. But then as I sort of reflected on it and actually saw some of the media that the younger people were taking in, I sort of came to appreciate it. And no, I'm not going to personally invest in this trend. I just think trends are interesting. Obviously, this isn't mind-blowing. This is, again, the 20-year rule. If you don't know the 20-year rule, every 20 years, something from 20 years ago becomes trendy in fashion or in the media. So this is sort of an expansion on that. In the early 2020s, you saw the early 2000s, 20 years earlier, becoming popular. But what you can't predict is what from that era will become trendy or popular. Look, if I had to guess, I would have thought it would be indie sleaze that would have become popular. But anyway, hope you enjoyed this little deep dive of how Y2K has evolved and is continuing to evolve. Anyway, my name is Carson. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please like and subscribe and have a wonderful day.